Welcome to States of America. This week, why the first cookbook by an African-American woman from the 1800s is significant in the 21st century. And the election is over, but the Patriot Movement lives on. Why this right-leaning group shouldn't be ignored in future elections. But first, as COVID cases climb, skepticism of the vaccine also surges among communities of color. Why women are the ones who can shift perceptions. All right, let's get into it. Recent polls show that Black and Latino groups are hesitant when it comes to the COVID vaccine. However, my next guest says that it's actually women who will be critical in dispelling these fears. USA Today environmental and health inequities reporter Neda Hassanein joins us now. Neda, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you, Ralphie?
Tell us, how can women help change this perception, especially among Black and Latino communities?
What experts have been telling me, and mostly physicians who are also coming from these communities, have been telling me that they're actually women of color have to be the first kind of like the efforts to educate and help them kind of understand the safeties surrounding the vaccine. But that's also a challenge because none of the clinical trials have been done on pregnant women. So there is this sort of added distrust, if you will.
What is it about these communities in particular where, women are in these leadership roles?
So in Black and Latino multi-generational households, women of color are typically heads of the household. There's this matriarchal culture. There's also a lot of multi-generational households. So, for example, grandparents, grandmothers raising their grandchildren. There's filial piety, I guess you could say, but and a respect for elders that kind of creates a sort of close bond with the senior women in the community or in the household.
Here in New York, Sandra Lindsay, who is a nurse and a woman of color, one of the first to receive the COVID vaccine, when other communities of color see her receiving it and saying, hey, this is the light at the end of the tunnel and this is going to be okay, how much does that help in this whole process?
So Dr. Odadina, who's over at the University of Florida Health Equity Center, actually brought this up. She's been doing a focus group with minorities, men and women. And one thing that she has been stressing is that leaders who belong to these demographics should be willing to kind of publicize their willingness to take the vaccine to sort of model, that, hey, we're doctors, we're women of color, we've studied this and it's okay to take this vaccine. But on the other hand, I've had other women of color tell me that they'd actually prefer to see white folks in, high positions, specifically like elected officials. She specifically said, in high positions of power who have better access to, healthcare and quality healthcare. Those are the things that she pointed to. And I think it would send the message that a white person is willing to take the vaccine and not that communities of color are being targeted to test it.
So, it sounds like we need to see not just one group of people or one segment of the population take this vaccine, but rather a broad amount to kind of put everyone, and especially communities of color, at ease. Is that kind of what we're getting at here?
Yes, that's correct. And there's also a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of reaching marginalized communities and helping get the message out in a way that's palatable and appealing.
But why aren't these communities more interested in taking this vaccine? Because COVID has done so much damage to these communities.
Yeah, history has imprinted this. There have been several kind of studies and and experiments that have kind of planted the seed of distrust. And, it's pretty understandable. I mean, there was a Tuskegee study that involved African-American men who the government had said to them that they would be receiving health care, but actually they were being studied for, syphilis. They weren't actually given the treatment for it. And so once that came to light, there was a lot of anger, understandably. And there was also Henrietta Lacks. For those who might not have heard of her, she was a Black woman whose cancer cells were used without her or her family's permission. And they're still used to this day. And they've been really critical for many cancer studies. But there's this sort of sentiment ever since these two, incidents. There's been this sentiment of, people of color being perceived as sort of guinea pigs or, being used and not treated as human. And so these are sort of those are seeds that are really kind of hard to dismantle.
Neda Hassanein, USA Today's environmental and health inequities reporter. Neda, thank you so much for the story and also for your time here for States of America.
Sure thing. Thanks, Ralphie.
We saw that same mindset at work with conspiracies about Dr. Fauci or the coronavirus being a bioweapon.
For many Americans, this year's election was the most divisive in their lifetime. Friendships were lost, family members pushed away. Divisions ran deep as people gravitated to political groups they felt voiced their beliefs. One of those groups is Arizona's own Patriot Movement, which has seen its influence over the state's Republican politics grow for years. To talk about that, we welcome Rich Rellis, a reporter with our sister paper in Phoenix, the Arizona Republic, who has done extensive reporting on this group and its motives. Hi, Rich. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for giving me an excuse to wear a collared shirt.
Always good in this time. So you've covered the Patriot Movement at length this year, and your reporting described, at least in part, dark and hate-filled beliefs that motivated the members of the Patriot Movement. Tell us a little bit about just, what the Patriot Movement is and its rise in Arizona.
Right. The movement itself is essentially, it picks up the scraps of the Tea Party, which kind of died when Ted Cruz stopped running for president. And when Donald Trump took over, the ashes of the Tea Party became that right-wing Patriot Movement.
So groups like the Patriot Movement tend to be really closely knit and sort of, not super open to outsiders. So how did you get access to some of this information or, just come to sort of see what the ideology of this membership was?
Yeah, we gained access. We've decided not to really say how we did so, although it wasn't anything nefarious or we didn't hack in or anything. And it wasn't as if we saw a select group of messages. We saw the whole thing, and we were able to sort of really delve into, my colleague Rob Odell talks about it being like falling down a rabbit hole into these conspiracies and hate-filled, xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic posts that really gave us an insight into the mindset of this group. The Patriot Movement is different from some of these other ideological groups in that the Tea Party had a lot of policy in mind and were deeply rooted in how the political system works. This is a group that, for the most part, many of the people I talked to hadn't been excited about politics or been into politics until Donald Trump's candidacy. And so they're new to the system, new to how things work, and their ideology is essentially Trump-based. We found a lot of what the public sees as, they're against Sharia law, the adoption of Sharia law, or against, in Arizona, the sex education in schools, some very discrete policy movements, Second Amendment rallies, things like that. What we found by looking at a private Facebook group was a lot of those ideologies spring out of very dark thoughts, anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, and a lot of conspiratorial thinking. And so it sort of gave us a clue into not just this particular group, but into a mindset that we see continuing on this year. The post we saw went up until about late 2019, but we've seen that mindset evolve and continue when Arizona started shutting down it stayed, or the governor had a stay-at-home order. We saw that same mindset at work with conspiracies about Dr. Fauci or the coronavirus being a bioweapon. And we've seen the same mindset and some of the same characters outside the state capitol in recent weeks protesting Arizona's certification of its election.
When we talk about the Tea Party, we're talking about a movement that really started after Barack Obama was nominated to his first term. Obviously, those lawmakers and the supporters were very anti-Obama, but made argument that they were fiscally conservative. They wanted lower taxes. They wanted less government intrusion. And they had some big wins, right? Eric Cantor losing in the House. That's when that movement really gained popularity around 2010. Who are some of the politicians who have aligned themselves with the Patriot Movement, whether that's in Arizona or, nationally?
Yeah, aligning themselves is difficult to parse. What we found, looking at even just the people who are in the group, there are some people definitely who were patriots first and then run for office or become part of the Republican Party's mechanisms, become precinct committee people and things like that. It's difficult to know how many of the politicians are actually holding these beliefs, or if they just need to kind of play footsie with these people. There's a Republican pollster, or a pollster I talked to here in Arizona about the Republican Party here, and I think we've seen this nationwide as well, is that the Republican Party lost a lot of suburban women in the 2006, after the 2016 election. They needed to shore that up. So to replace those votes, at least here in Arizona, they went rural to rural Arizona, and to get a lot of newcomers. There's a lot of people who weren't attracted to politics before Trump. And so the Republican Party needed this energy. And so where, Trump came very close to winning Arizona, he came within a percentage point, even though he lost much of the population centers. And where that support comes from is rural Arizona and these new voters who are now invigorated into the process. But the head of the state Republican Party, a woman named Kelly Ward, she sort of was a darling of this Patriot movement and now leads the party and is now plaintiff on a bunch of lawsuits contesting the election that have hit. They've been thrown out of county court, but have headed to federal court.
When you say, these folks were maybe activated for the first time in politics by Donald Trump, is there a similar effect on the left? Have there been any groups that have sort of seen the same kind of rise with maybe folks who were never really involved in politics, or who have really, had an effect on local and national politics on the left?
It's hard to find the corollary. Yes, we've seen a progressive wing, and we've seen people energized by Bernie Sanders or AOC, the congresswoman in New York. But it's not this. This is unique, and the mindset, again, is not so much rational policy discussions, but at least what we found looking through a Facebook page that they didn't think most people would have access to is a lot of deep conspiratorial thoughts.
So you mentioned Sharia law being an issue that the Patriot Movement has brought up. What exactly are the concerns around Sharia law, and what are they saying when they talk about Sharia law as an issue?
They are truly worried that the country will drop what this group considers its Judeo-Christian principles and start adopting laws written in the Quran as the laws of the United States. It is essentially very thinly veiled Islamophobia.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see, what happens with this group moving forward now under a Biden presidency. If you want to hear more about Arizona politics or Rich's reporting on this topic, check out the Gaggle podcast from the Arizona Republic with new episodes weekly. Thanks for joining us, Rich.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Many of the poems in the book are recipes, but they're also a survival guide of sorts for Black women raising children, especially boys.
It's not just in history books about politicians where we can learn a thing or two about America's pioneering spirit. Our next guest says we can actually learn something from the culinary world. Dr. Sherrard wrote an article where she followed along recipes from the first Black female cookbook author, and she joins us now to discuss.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
So I guess let's start at the beginning here, because one of the interesting things that came out to me about the article that you wrote on following these different recipes, or as Melinda Russell called them in A Domestic Cookbook, receipts, the first word kind of that was used, was the fact that there was even one of these books published, especially when you fast forward to current day and we're still having conversations and there are still studies about the lack of diversity in publishing. So how did this book come about? Did you find out?
Yeah, so there's only so much we do know about the book. It was published in 1866, so about a year after the Civil War in Michigan. And the reason I discovered the book is I was reading a culinary historian's book about Black cookbooks, a woman known as Toni Tipton Martin. And this is where I first encountered pages from the book, which I then was able to get a copy from University of Michigan's library. So the circumstances around its publication, we only know really what the author tells us in the prologue to the book, which is that she produces it to support herself and her young son.
Did it surprise you that this book was able to be published, to see the light of day, and able to obviously land in your hands from 1866? Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I teach a lot of 19th century Black writing, and so I've been really familiar with reading slave narratives like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs' biography. But a cookbook, especially written by a free woman of color during this period, is still a pretty unusual and special item. And as far as we know, it's the earliest known cookbook, but there could be others out there.
What did you learn from the past by reading through her recipes?
One of the things I learned was just a level of admiration for her courage and ingenuity in writing the cookbook and thinking that she could distribute it herself and really speak as an authority to an audience that would have been primarily upper class white women who were managing their own kitchens or entertaining or looking to add a bit of flair to their cooking repertoire. You
kind of, throughout your I guess, analysis of this cookbook, you talk about the recipes and some of their complexity, but you also talk about the poetry that was involved as well. What struck you, I guess, specifically about the language of this cookbook?
Well, I love the direct address when she would turn to the reader within a list of imperatives, do this, add that, take this. That struck me as language that could be made into poetry. And in fact, the reason that I started this engagement with the cookbook was because I was writing a book of poetry, and inspired partly by the cookbook.
But as far as the culinary world now here in 2020, as it relates to, Black cooks and Black cookbook authors, what did you learn anything? Were you enlightened about anything that's happening now or that may happen in the future?
Well, I think the fact that her repertoire was not just Southern. I think there used to be this assumption that African-American cooking was primarily soul food. And she certainly has recipes in that book that we would know, like sweet potato pie, or that we would associate with Southern or traditional Black cooking. But she also has complicated European recipes like a Charlotte Russe cake, or a blancmange that requires chilling in the snow. She'd really mastered an international, or what I guess one might call continental, style of cooking that would have been popular during the time. So the sense of this being work that requires training and skill, a lineage that she cites as having learned the trade from other African-American cooks as well, just really, I think, runs counter to ideas that early cookbooks written by white authors that were representing recipes of their Black cooks as their own. I think having books like this and a lot of the other books coming out there show that there was real originality present from these Black authors.
As I'm reading your article about this cookbook, and you're kind of detailing some of the own struggles that you had following along with the recipes, I'm thinking to myself, this is, Dr. Sherrard, she's trying to actually, learn a few lessons, enlighten others. And yet, you're going through this thing in the kitchen where maybe you're even self-conscious of your own skills. Was that difficult too here or no?
Yeah, I'm not a trained cook. I mean, I cook. I think I am a good cook. I learned from my mother and my aunts and my family. But, there were instructions in that cookbook, like at one point she says to, open the oven while you're baking in order to create these light cakes that she really values and that the ladies that are her clients really love. And I'm thinking, am I really going to open my oven, for 15 minutes while I'm trying to make this cake? Obviously, a 21st century oven is not the same as what she would have been working on during the time. So that was one of the challenges.
Dr. Sherrard, you mentioned that you kind of embarked on this journey as you were writing a book of poetry. Did anything from the cookbook make it into that book you were writing?
For sure. Several of the poems are based or inspired by recipes from Melinda Russell. I really see the poetry book as a conversation with Melinda Russell as well. One poem uses lines from marble cake, which is a recipe in the book. And I can read a little bit of it. There's time.
I would love that. Absolutely.
Okay. So, and this is the book, Grimoire. I wanted to get a cover that kind of looked like a cookbook in some way. Marble cake, the white. My son, half cup white flour, 1/4 brown sugar, has trouble with fractions. When pregnant, I did not follow instructions. Beat the yolks and sugar together until very light. It was months before I accepted I was carrying another human being. Add half-pound butter, whip 14 egg whites, flavor with lemon, half Jill brandy. The dark. The ophthalmologist suspects that he's colorblind. Half cup molasses, the yolk of 8 eggs. Perhaps that is why he prefers brown sugar in his oatmeal. He can't tell how it's different from white. Flavor with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, or mace. I confess I palm the iron pills, drink light roast brews without sugar or cream. Mixed children usually come out beautifully. The doctor is unsure about mine. Paper and butter the pan, first a layer of white, then of the dark, alternately finishing with the white. So in that poem, several of the lines are actually drawn directly from Melinda Russell's recipe and then mixed in with words that I imagined on my own.
Because it was beautiful and so well done. And I was going to ask where the rest of the inspiration for that came from.
I saw a connection between cooking and child rearing. So many of the poems in the book are recipes, but they're also a survival guide of sorts for Black women raising children, especially boys, under precarious circumstances. And for me, this resonated with Melinda Russell's motive for publishing the cookbook, which she said explicitly was to support herself and her disabled son.
Incredible. Dr. Shireen Sherrard, thank you again for the time. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ralphie Aversa, and this is States of America, honest conversations on the issues that matter most.